Good evening, everyone. I am Erica Wagner, and I am thrilled to welcome Sebastian Barry to this Faber members event to discuss his wonderful novel, A Thousand Moons. This is a apologies. This is a long delayed conversation. Sebastian and I were meant to appear before you in person when the book came out in hardback last year. The virus, alas, put paid to that, so I am even more delighted to be here to celebrate the book's publication in paperback. We have only one path across the mire of remembrance, says Winona Cole on the opening pages of this novel. She understands that much of what she recounts may not be considered credible, even to herself. I say to myself, could that have really happened? Did I really do that? But many of her listeners, many of you, will have heard her father's tale and learned to give themselves over to belief in the face of incredulity. Because, of course, Winona's adoptive father is Thomas McNulty, narrator of Days Without End, which won Costa Book of the Year in 2017. In A Thousand Moons, Winona, the Lakota girl adopted by McNulty and John Cole in the aftermath of a massacre, picks up the story of a new kind of family forged in a new kind of nation. But the founding sins of that nation will be visited upon Winona and those she loves. Her author is one of our most acclaimed, A Long, Long Way, about Irish soldiers fighting for the crown in the First World War, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2005, and The Secret Scripture, in which a woman looks back on how the rigid social constraints of her time saw her confined to an asylum, was shortlisted for the prize 3 years later and made into a film directed by Jim Sheridan. Sebastian Barry is also an acclaimed dramatist, and one of the many wonderful things about his novels is the way in which they are infused with the theatrical in the very best sense of the word. Like a master of the stage, he conjures a complete world for his readers, whatever the setting. But to me, his reckoning with the 19th century American project in this latest pair of novels is particularly striking and powerful. And I dare say, especially so now in 2021, when the costs of that American project are so glaringly apparent. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation, and I know you all are too. Welcome, Sebastian. It's great to be here with you.
And I'm delighted to be talking to you, Eric.
So I would like to begin by returning to Days Without End. And if you would perhaps remind us of the origins of that novel, which I think are in two parts. I think there's a familial origin for you, but then also you had a connection to the period in which it's set. There is a Thomas McNulty who took part in the Indian Wars and the Civil War. So maybe lay out the background for us a little bit before we move forward.
Somewhere still behind all this is a still unnamed person, or a person whose name is not retrieved by any work I've done. But you know, in the usual way of that the accidental nature of my own first family, as you might say, I shared a bed with my wonderful grandfather, my mother's father, in the darks of an Irish winter, and he told me many things in that bed, all his adventures in the British Army and the Merchant Navy and so on, and all traveling all over the world. But at one night, he said in passing that that his uncle had been at the Indian Wars, which was quite an exciting statement, which alas he never elaborated on for me, who had faithfully been up for the Saturday matinee in the Adelphi Cinema in Dunleary watching all the cowboy films. So I thought I knew what he was talking about. Of course, I didn't. It took another 50 years more of thinking about that and not thinking about that, which is equally important in the making of a book, to reach the moment where my utterly amazing son Toby was unhappy with things, and very worryingly for his father and his mother and his family. And eventually, it turned out that what was troubling him was the fact that he was gay, and he didn't know how we would react. Of course, we reacted with relief and joy when he told us. And somehow those two things, those two moments, those two familiar moments, so divided by so many years, prompted the writing of Days Without End. And so, I mean, a book can never be independent of you. I mean, it's obvious, but these books particularly seem, while they're the furthest away of my books, as you might say, nevertheless seem very much entwined, implicated in my own DNA and my own imagination.
Did you know when you set out on this project? Of course, many of your novels have connections between them. But did you know that there would be another book like this coming when you embarked on Days Without End?
Well, I think you said it correctly there. They're all, these 8 books, so far 8, are all talking to each other, or not talking to each other, or being angry with each other. And that, I didn't set out to do that, 20 years ago when we first met. With the first book, The Whereabouts of Ennis McNulty, I didn't know there'd be a second book related in some way to that book. No, and I think there's a proper nature to just being in the dark. It's a very important element. And I had written Days Without End, and I was actually at an event. This thing we're prevented from doing except in this magical way. And somebody spoke to me about Winona and said they were troubled by the fact that she wasn't speaking for herself. I mean, I am hugely sensitized to a remark like that, because my son Toby, as you can imagine, is the most woke person on God's earth. So I'm always making mistakes with him and being gently reprimanded, and indeed my other kids as well. So I was very, very attentive to that. And people say lots of things, and that's the great thing about book events. People say astonishing things to you. You get much more from your audience than they get from you, I think. And I went home with that kind of slightly stinging in my blood. And when I thought about it, and I also thought of my own daughters and how, I revere them and I worship them. But of course, that's not necessarily how they appear to themselves. So my job then, I thought, was to try and see if Winona would be just generous and gracious and mad enough to speak through such an rather unpromising medium as myself, so that she would be speaking for herself insofar as I could make that happen. And of course, we're still 1,000 miles away from anything authentic, as you might say. But it seemed to me an important thing, and I was very intrigued by the experience of doing it, because while Thomas is quite vigorous and rigorous and funny and sort of in command of the pony of his life in a funny sort of way, she's much quieter. And she was so quiet in this very place where I'm talking to you, in this workroom, so quiet that it was almost a language too small, too unheard to write down. But it just put an enchantment into this little workroom trying to do that, because it seemed to me quite a difficult task, to be honest.
I will just interject to say, because you mentioned someone asking you a question from the audience, that although we are not all in a room together, excuse me, we do have the facility for questions. I believe that you as the audience can drop a question by text. I will see it and then relay it to Sebastian. So please, at any time that it occurs to you, just type your question in and I will keep checking.
Yes, we're not all in a room together, but we're all in our rooms together.
We
That'll
are,
do it in a minute.
which we like to think is kind of even more intimate, actually.
It's actually wonderful. And in case I forget, I just want to thank you, Erica, for doing this. I want to thank bookshops.org and Faber members, in case I forget at the end, because actually it's a lovely, lovely thing to do.
It is a lovely thing to do, and I am very glad to be here, I will say again. But what you were saying just now about Winona speaking for herself, as she does in this novel, but to me what's so fascinating about the opening of the novel is the way that she does, but then there is an undercutting, I would say, in the way that she describes herself, in the way that she says or does not say her name. I am Winona, she says, and it's a one sentence paragraph. And then says, and I'm going to try and pronounce this correctly, in early time, I was Ojinjinka, which means rose. Thomas McNulty tried very hard to say this name, but he failed. And so he gave me my dead cousin's name because it was easier in his mouth. So I'm fascinated by this opening of this wonderful novel because it kind of acknowledges the problem that you have. I wondered if you'd say a little bit more about your choice to speak in this girl's voice.
Well, an early title for the book was The Lost Prairie Rose, which is a song. And I went about looking for the Lakota name for rose, which is Otijinka. But as always, it took so long waiting for this book, 7 or 8 months. And my patient editor, Angus Cargill, waiting at the other end, as it were. And we've done so many books together now. I mean, 15 years of them. So it's a real relationship, sort of almost like an impromptu telephone of some sort. But I remember writing I am Winona, just those 3 words, and emailing them to him because I was actually a tremble. It's hard to explain that, but because you have to have the first line before you have everything else, of course. But the first line also implies the rest of the book. It's there like a landscape that if you tilt it, that first line, if you tilt it, the rest of the book is behind it. So it won't be behind a false first sentence. It's just nothing there. I mean, even if you got a better start, it won't be the right start. So, and then Winona is the name of one of the Lakota women who's killed probably by Thomas and John in Days Without End. It's the only name he probably knows that would suit her. So he gives her that name. So yes, immediately I am affrighted and overwhelmed, which is why I was a tremble sending those words. Because I knew we were in the most, well, those deep waters, those deep rivers that are so clement looking, but they will tear you down. They will tear you. They will pluck you from the surface if you're so foolish as to swim in them. So I was very alerted in some way to the supreme emergency, actually, of her life. the sense of responsibility was almost annihilating, you know, almost would stop you in your tracks and you'd go no further. And the book would be I Am Winona and leave it at that. Just about. Because the questions, you know, Erica, you think you'll agree, the questions are, they're almost too big. If you think of America now, through all the hideous kerfuffle of Trumpism, even through the Obama years, all the years I've looked at America since thinking about these things, it's rarely that native matters arise. And yet in my heart, I believe that it's a country taken from native peoples. That's what I believe. You know, I may be wrong, or I may be right, or I may be half right, I may be stupid or foolish. It doesn't probably matter what I think. But it's it's because it's difficult to tell your children your country was built on a genocide that people don't say it, probably, maybe more so nowadays. But I knew I was the only passport I have for doing that, though, is also having spent 40 years thinking about what it is to be Irish, what it is to be both a native person and also a colonizer, you might say. And somehow or other, the soul and spirit of someone like Winona resolves in me a huge difficulty. She kind of is an answering song, clearly said, even though she has trouble remembering, to the riddle that I feel myself to be as an Irish person, the unanswered riddle, the tangled wool of whatever I am.
That's really fascinating, and it it brings me, because I might kind of salt in some of our audience questions, and I was going to ask you to read, and I will in a moment. But what you've just said, you know, raises one question someone asked, directly, this question of what is called cultural appropriation.
Hmm.
And the questioner talks about a friend who wrote a young reader's novel that was about a First Nations girl, and ended up not going forward, apparently, because of this issue of cultural appropriation. And so the questioner is asking about your own, whether you encountered any bumps in the road, says this reader. But I think, you know, to me, the question is how novels are vehicles of imaginative empathy. But what you have just said about your experience as an Irish person, I think is very germane to this. Can you expand on that a little more?
Well, you know, a book is either written or not written, and then it's either published or not published. But nothing on earth, no decree, even no sensitivity, even no second thought should ever prevent any writer from writing the book that she needs to write next, because each book is a stepping stone across the stormy isthmus of their life. You can't leave out, it's the nature of a stepping stone, system of stepping stones, that you cannot leave one out because you drown. So you must write it. That's the first thing. But truly, I say, I mean, in On Canaan's Side, one of the other books, Mr. Dillinger, who actually is based, and I can say it now because sadly he's no longer with us, on Peter Matheson, a brief friendship I had with Peter, who concerned himself enormously with modern day Native American issues, I suppose you'd say. I mean, he devoted his life partly to that and got into enormous trouble for doing that. But Peter Matheson, or rather Mr. Dillinger in On Canaan's Side, says to Lily, my great aunt, or my imagined great aunt, that the most important thing we've been told in our lifetimes is about DNA. And he said all modern humans share the same, go back to the same 4 or 5 women in Africa. So therefore, he meant everyone. I mean, Japanese or people in Mullingar, wherever you want. And therefore, he said the good news is we're all the same family. And the bad news is we're all the same family because of we know the terrible trouble that comes out of families, but also all the other wondrous things.